Let's begin this fascinating journey to learning all about portrait lighting techniques. I'll be starting with the basics, then we'll get into some rather heavy details. But it's worth it because a thorough understanding of how to see, manipulate, and create light will separate your images from the amateurs.
The whole point of all this lighting instruction is really about getting light into the front of the face. It's that simple. And one tip to see if you've done it correctly is to look for catch lights in the eyes in the 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock position.
If the catch lights are at a 10 or a 2 o'clock position, that means that the main light is in a good location relative to the face. So when I'm making a photograph for the yearbook or trying to tell a nice story, I want to use lighting that will reinforce that purpose.
But let's say we're trying to create an image with more impact for a strong look. Lower light can work for that purpose. So whether it's a guy or a girl, the same technique applies. Light slightly above the faces for nice images, and low light is used for strong or dramatic images. But always be sure to have the subject tilt his or her head in whatever direction is necessary to avoid extremely low ghoul lighting, which can make them look sinister, unless that's your goal.
This kind of dramatic lighting can work for character portraits of seniors of all ages.
If you are reasonably good at studio lighting, you already know how people should be lit outside. The tools and approaches are different, if not opposite, but the lighting fundamentals are the same. So our goal as professionals of shooting outside should be to control light and be able to create images outside
that look similar to those that were created inside. Obviously, there'll be some differences, and we don't want images to be so controlled that they look artificial. But some control is necessary for professional results.
Being a good on-location shooter means that in time, you must be able to handle all kinds of lighting obstacles in your way. You need to know additive, subtractive, strobe, ambient, and color temperatures.
I'll also often cover some lighting techniques outside, and then later those same techniques inside. I did it that way because you can watch how I work outside and then how I work inside without wondering if that technique would work in either place.
Here's the list of all the lighting techniques that I'll be demonstrating.
We'll start with what should often be our first choice, the existing light. It might also be called ambient, available, or natural light. However, I'd prefer that the term natural light refer to nature's light, whereas the other terms could be used for room lights or other human-made lighting. Then we'll talk about reflecting that existing light. The next very important topic is blocking unwanted light. One of my favorite light modifying tools is to diffuse hard sunlight through a white scrim. LED lighting is a tool that's being developed, adapted, and improved, and has some very useful and unique abilities for us professional photographers. The tool that I use the most is a small speed light in a softbox, and I'll cover that extensively. I don't use high-powered strobes very much because I work later in the evening, but I'll share a few thoughts on those. Finally, I'll touch on a very fascinating process that allows us to create an image that can only be done this way.
But don't worry, you don't need to learn it all at once. I learned one technique each year. This portion of the program will deal with working with existing light without any light modifiers. We'll begin with hard sunlight.
I'm showing a few of my wife over a period of a few years to demonstrate that when I first started, I didn't really fully understand that sunlight is difficult to work with and not always the most flattering. I learned to keep the sunlight behind the subject, but I still didn't know that it shouldn't bleed around to strike the face. But if it does, it should only be a sliver of an accent. And finally, adding a reflector, in this case a white van that I had, provided a better facial light.
The most difficult time to shoot is when the sun is high in the sky. The contrast is extreme. The angle of light and shadows is unflattering. The colors aren't rich. The light is so bright the subject may squint. Plus, if you're in a warm part of the country, it can be oppressively hot. So if at all possible, try to avoid the middle of the day. That's why I work outside only in the early morning and late afternoon and into the evening. It would be great if the lighting were always this easy. This was done at sunset, and we'll talk about that later. But obviously we can't always shoot when the lighting is so even. Same girl, same location, but too early in the afternoon on a sunny day, and we'll run into this problem. Contrast is the culprit here. She's in bright sun, but the background is in deep shade. This was done at the same time as the previous image. Why is this acceptable when the other image wasn't? Because the sun is approximately at my back, more evenly lighting the entire image. For what it's worth, I realize this isn't a great photograph, but it's an acceptable way to deal with the issue of the sun without having to use light control devices.
Here's another one using that basic same technique of keeping the sun pretty much to my back, and I just had her look down so that she wouldn't squint from the sunlight. This was from a morning session that had clouds coming and going. But you just can't use a high sun for portraits like this. So I waited for a passing cloud and then did this. But that's not to say that hard sun can't be used. I had her close her eyes and let the sun and shadows play on her. The more you know, the more options you have. Learning the basics of flattering portrait lighting helps you to instruct your subjects to look their best and separates you from those who don't know how. I've created a series of images with the various lighting patterns, and I'll describe how each was done. Keep in mind that there are other names given to some of these patterns, but these are the ones that I choose to use. In these next lighting pattern photos, I'm showing the main light, so I'm going to go with a pretty weak fill light. The amount of fill light can vary depending on what we want, but that doesn't change the light pattern. I used a large softbox behind the camera so that all the light comes from the axis of the camera to the subject. I placed a light with a small dish reflector low and pointed up at the subject. A small light above the subject makes a butterfly-shaped shadow under the nose. Now on this one there's no catch light, but there can be one depending on the person's face. With a small nose or deep-set eyes, you won't get a catch light. In those cases, I simply add one in Photoshop. I kept the main light in the same place as in the butterfly example, but I added a large reflector underneath the subject. The main light is positioned so that there's a loop shadow from the nose going downward and toward the cheek, but not touching that cheek shadow. When we move the light farther to the side so the shadow does touch that cheek shadow, it's called Rembrandt. It was given that name because the artist used that pattern often. Moving that light farther to the side, we get a light and shadow that splits the face in half. I moved the light even farther to the side, even a bit behind the face, and added a duplicate light on the opposite side. Cross lighting is a pattern with two lights of equal intensity on either side of the face, and it can be either a loop or a Rembrandt pattern. It's undesirable though because there are two nose shadows and you get that goatee shadow under the chin. With a face that's aimed away from the camera, lighting the near side is called broad light. That's because it's the broadest part of the face that we see. Conversely, if we place the light such that it lights the part of the face that we see less of, or the short side, it's called short light. Profile lighting is described as lighting the front profile of a face when the person is in side profile to the camera. It isn't really a lighting pattern though, because it could be loop light, Rembrandt, or rim light. It just means that the front of the side profile of the person is lit. Another form of profile lighting that we call rim light for just a sliver light along the outline of the person. Now this might be a little confusing though because it's still rim lighting no matter what direction the person is facing. It could be light that accents the person's hair or body from behind as they face the camera. So it's not just a facial lighting pattern. A silhouette means showing the outline of the person with the background being very light and the subject being very dark. Whether we get there with sunlight, soft light, subtractive lighting, or additive lighting, as with these softboxes, short light and broad light are the two most prevalent patterns we have to know how to achieve.
With the strong sunlight we have in the summer, we'll typically have too much contrast. Even with the light-colored sand, there's still too much contrast, as well as the problem of all that light causing her to squint as she tries to look at the camera. That problem can be solved simply by having the subject look away. The direction I instructed her to turn gave me a Rembrandt type of facial lighting.
This rubbed me the wrong way because the lighting just wasn't making it. That tiny sliver of sunlight on her near cheek wasn't enough to look right. So I had her turn her head a bit more toward the sun. This creates a Rembrandt lighting pattern, and it just feels better. Turning her head even more also looks good because it's another accepted lighting pattern. A loop for the little loop shadow from the nose. So knowing those patterns helps us to recognize problems and easily fix them on the spot. Knowing those lighting rules helps when you run into challenging situations. Here I had her head tilted down, but it was too far, and that caused bad shadows. But bringing her head up for that butterfly pattern helped. Knowing light patterns helped me to get this image using the setting sun.
Sometimes you can use the sun to chisel the cheekbones by having the subject tilt her head up and close her eyes.
When you have an attractive subject, You can get away with less than perfect lighting. In fact, that's when I deliberately experiment with more unusual lighting. I went for a butterfly light pattern here, and that it got its name by the shape of the shadow under the nose. So even though her head is turned away from the camera, an attractive lighting pattern still works. Again, applying that knowledge helps us in tough lighting situations.
Since sunlight can cause all those problems on faces, I had her turn away from the sun to show her beautiful hair. Specular light is actually the best choice for hair. Watch hair color commercials on TV. They'll often use a small light source to make the hair shine.